had an 8th grade English teacher by the name of Mrs. Fine. She weighed in about 300 pounds, had this big hairy wart on her chin, little black hairs prickling out, a thin, cruel smile, and these mean little eyes. She would waddle around the room and cackle her sarcastic remarks. It's a woman who worshipped at the altar of prescriptive English grammar, where gleefully she sacrificed the egos of the young teenagers in the class. And oh, did we hate her. Now, you might not have a Mrs. Fine in your school years, but if the word grammar sends chills up your back, conjures up an image of an old lady with a wooden ruler ready to smack your hands for a grammar faux pas, well then you know the grammar ghost. And as a professor of the English language, I feel it my duty, my right, and my obligation to conduct an exorcism. Our story, being a ghost story, begins as all ghost stories begin, with a dead person. Actually, with many dead people, but one particular dead person plays a central role in this story. The good Bishop Richard Lowth. L-O-W-T-H. And I consider it part of the genius of the language that his name is a mere sound-alike for the verb to loathe, to despise and detest intensely. Because good Bishop Lowth loathed the unruly nature of the English language. He considered English a vulgar language, a mischievous child that needed to be tamed, and he would take it upon himself to do the taming. So in the 18th century, he wrote a book of grammar rules, a book that continued to influence grammar instruction for nearly 200 years. Now, the good bishop needed a virtuous model, an example, an exemplar case of virtuous grammar, and there he found it in Latin. The elevated language of the Mass would uplift the crude, earthy language of the masses. And so Bishop Lowth decided that if you could do something in English that was not possible in Latin, that was wrong, and it should be condemned as a grammar fault. So, for example, whereas in Latin you cannot end a sentence with a preposition, the good Bishop Lowth decided that in English thou shalt not end thy sentences with prepositions. And as Winston Churchill once remarked, that is the sort of English up with which I shall not put. And I must say, that's something I completely agree with. But the longest lasting legacy of Bishop Lowth's loathing is the taboo against the split infinitive. Now, some of you may not know what a split infinitive is, and more credit to you. But to remind you, an infinitive is the verb to combined with the verb. To eat, to enjoy, to speak, to stand, to orate. Those are all infinitives, to plus a verb. Now you'll notice in English there's two words, which means there is space between the to and the verb. And one might be tempted to slip an adverb in that space, or a set of words in that space. To joyfully dance. Well, that is the split infinitive. Now in Latin, because the infinitive marker is connected to the verb, you cannot split an infinitive. Therefore, in English, thou shalt not split an infinitive. Let me tell you that the taboo against the split infinitive has roiled the prim and proper at the English language ball. In fact, in 1860, the British government refused to sign a treaty with the United States until a split infinitive was removed from the text. And I have witnessed a Toastmasters meeting where the grammarian took the speaker to task for having split an infinitive. Clearly there was a Mrs. Fine in his background. However, It is perfectly acceptable to split an infinitive in English, and we have the television show Star Trek guide the way. We all remember to boldly go. That's a split infinitive, and it is far superior to either the alternative boldly to go or to go boldly for at least two reasons. The first being linguistic, the second being poetic. If we think linguistically, well, the defenders of the taboo against split infinitives have always argued that the to and the verb form a unit, and that unit should never be split. But by that same logic, you could say the to marks the beginning of the infinitive, and the verb marks the end of the infinitive. And so to boldly go creates a new unit, a unique unit with a meaning all of its own. It's a little bit like a sandwich. You have two pieces of bread, and you have the ham and cheese, you've got the mayonnaise and mustard in between. And who would want to eat a sandwich with two pieces of bread and the ham and cheese on the outside with the mayonnaise and mustard outside? That is a sandwich up with which I will not approve. But it's more than that. There's rhythm. There's the poetry of the language. To boldly go. Listen to that rhythm. Pa-pa-pa-pa. That is the rhythm that's the weak, strong rhythm that Shakespeare was so fond of, and that is a cornerstone of the English poetic tradition. If we did boldly to go, we would have two weak syllables, le, to, together, and we don't like that. That's awkward. If we did to go boldly, we would have two strong syllables, go and bold together, and that sounds very aggressive. We don't like that either. So to boldly go is actually a perfectly neat rhythmic unit and an example of a fine split infinitive. But it's not just to boldly go that justifies the splitting of the infinitive. In fact, if we don't, we open the door to ambiguity. So for example, if I say, he failed completely to recognize the fact, there's two possible meanings. I could say, he didn't recognize the fact at all, or I could mean he only partially recognized the fact. And if my meaning is that he only partially recognized the fact, I can resolve the ambiguity by splitting the infinitive. He failed to completely recognize the fact. So my friends, and Toastmasters, and guests, I'm here to tell you that Bishop Loth was wrong. I want you to enjoy the richness of the English language. I want you to shamelessly indulge in the richness of the English language. To, without fear, to freely and with the full permission of an English language professional, split your infinitive. And if you didn't catch that, that was a hoagie-size, submarine-size split infinitive. And let's kick that grammar ghost in the nether parts.